There is a timeline that most people never lived long enough to remember. The cities grew quiet there, not from peace, but from something older and heavier than peace. Into that silence, a child was born. He never chose the weight that was placed upon him, but he carried it steadily, as though he had been made for nothing else. He grew up in a world where hope had to be rebuilt each day, from whatever small pieces remained. His name was Trunks. Before you drift into sleep, you're welcome to subscribe for more calm Dragon Ball stories. And if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight. And when the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll be giving away a Goku figure. To enter, just subscribe and leave a comment on the pinned post on the channel. The link is in the description. In the year 766, a child was Bulma, daughter of Dr. Brief, and one of the most brilliant minds that Earth had ever produced. His father was the Saiyan Prince Vegeta, though Trunks himself would not know what that truly meant for many years to come. The timeline Trunks was born into had not yet fallen entirely. The androids had not yet arrived. For a brief window of years, the world still resembled something ordinary, and the child who would one day carry the future on his shoulders slept peacefully in his mother's arms without any knowledge of what was coming for all of them. The androids designated as numbers 17 and 18 arrived when Trunks was still very young. They did not invade like an army with banners and declarations. They moved through cities like weather, unpredictable, purposeless in any meaningful sense, and without mercy. Within a short span of time, they had reduced Earth's greatest warriors to names spoken only in past tense. The heroes of Earth fell quickly, one after another, in ways that left no room for the usual process of response and recovery. Piccolo was gone, Krillin was gone, Yamcha and Tenshinhan and so many others, all silenced within a timeline where the Dragon Balls could not be used to undo their deaths. Piccolo's passing had caused Kami to fade as well, and with Kami gone, the Dragon Balls themselves had ceased to exist. The world had no wish left to make, no mechanism of restoration remained. Only two fighters survived into those years of aftermath. Gohan, the son of Goku, who had endured where others had not, older now, marked by time and fighting, carrying his losses without making them visible unless you knew how to look. And Bulma, who did not fight with fists but with something arguably more enduring than any physical strength the androids would have recognized as a threat. She fought with her mind, and with her refusal to accept that what had happened was the final word on anything. Goku had died not in battle, which would have made a different kind of sense, but from a heart virus, a quiet and entirely undramatic end for a man who had faced threats capable of reshaping the universe and had survived all of them. He died peacefully, in a bed, away from the fighting, in a way that felt profoundly unfair to everyone who had loved him. His passing left a silence that none of the surviving heroes could fill, no matter how long they tried. The world Trunks inherited was not built on glory, it was built on absence, on empty streets and closed windows, and the particular kind of stillness that arrives when people have learned, through enough repetition, that going outside might be the last decision they ever make. Before you drift into sleep, you're welcome to subscribe for more calm Dragon Ball stories. And if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight. Trunks grew up without knowing what his father looked like. There were no photographs of Vegeta in their home. Whatever records might have existed, whatever casual images a life accumulates as it moves through ordinary time, had either been destroyed in the chaos that followed the android's arrival, or had never existed to begin with. The Capsule Corporation building, once a landmark of invention and color and the comfortable noise of a family at work, had burned long ago. Many of the small ordinary things that people keep without thinking about them had gone with it. Trunks knew the basic facts. He knew that his father had been a prince, that Vegeta held a title attached to a kingdom that no longer existed, ruler of a people who had been destroyed before Trunks was born by a tyrant named Frieza, who had his own history, his own complicated relationship with the Saiyan race. He knew his father had been one of the last surviving members of that destroyed race. He knew his mother had loved Vegeta in her complicated and always characteristically Bulma way, which was never simple but was always genuine. But he had never been given a face to put with any of these facts. When he tried to picture his father searching the interior of his mind for something to hold on to, what he found was a silhouette, a figure seen from behind. Someone standing straight, both feet planted, facing something ahead that Trunks could not see from his angle, always moving forward, never once looking back at the direction from which he had come. It was a strange kind of portrait to carry through a childhood, the back of a man he had never met, outlined in some uncertain light, neither warm nor cold. He could not fill in the face, no matter how he tried, because there was nothing to fill it from. He had no reference. He had only the space where a face would be, and the particular quality of that absence, which was very specific and very present in its own way. He adapted. Children adapt to the shapes of the lives they are given. And Trunks adapted too. He grew up quieter than he might have otherwise been, more watchful, more careful, the kind of child who observes more than he speaks and carries more inside than he shows on the surface. He thought about asking his mother. He turned the question over for a long time, examining it from different angles in the way that children examine things they are uncertain about. He wondered what Vegeta had sounded like, what his expressions had been, what it might have felt like to sit in the same room as him, or to train beneath his supervision. But he held those questions carefully. Asking about his father felt, in some way he could not fully articulate at the time, like an admission that he needed something, and he was not certain that needing things was compatible with whatever it was he was trying to become. So he carried the silhouette in silence for years as he grew. Of all the people who shaped future Trunks into the person he eventually became, none left a mark as deep or as lasting as future Gohan. Gohan, in this timeline, had survived longer than anyone else. He was older now, quieter, and marked in visible ways by years of fighting that had taken far more from him than victories ever returned. He had lost his left arm in battle against the androids, a wound that had healed into something permanent, a scar of absence that served as a constant reminder of how dangerous these beings truly were and how mortal even the strongest fighters remained no matter how hard they trained. Despite everything, Gohan chose to train Trunks. He had made this decision deliberately and without anyone asking him to. Without any particular ceremony around it, he saw something in the young half-Saiyan that he recognized, perhaps from looking at himself in earlier years, or perhaps simply from the instinct of someone who has been shaped by good teachers and understands what it means to pass that shaping forward. Their sessions were not gentle. Gohan pushed Trunks with the same seriousness he brought to everything in his life, which was the only form of respect he knew how to offer. If Trunks was going to face the androids one day, and both of them understood, without discussing it constantly, that this day was coming regardless of either of their preferences, then he needed to be ready in ways that went beyond theoretical. Being ready meant being pushed past wherever he was comfortable stopping. Trunks admired Gohan with the complete and uncomplicated devotion that young people sometimes give to those who protect them without being asked. He looked at Gohan's missing arm not with pity or with the discomfort that such a visible injury can sometimes produce in witnesses, but with something closer to reverence. It was, in his eyes, a medal, evidence of battles fought and endured without flinching, proof that Gohan had faced the worst the world currently had to offer and kept standing anyway, and had done so for years. Gohan carried the weight of their arrangement quietly. He had become something like a guardian, something like an older brother, something like a teacher, all at once, occupying all three roles simultaneously in the way that circumstances sometimes demand of people who are available and willing. He had not expected to fill any of these roles. He had simply been the person who was present and who had the capacity to help. And so he had. Not many Dragon Ball fans know about a short story published alongside the Bardock special film anime comic. It was titled simply The Lone Warrior, and its subject was Trunks. The story was written by Aya Matsui, one of the writers who had contributed to the Dragon Ball anime itself. The illustrations were provided by Bor Ma, a figure who had worked on character design across Dragon Ball projects, stretching from Dr. Slump all the way to the Trunks television special. This was not a casual or hasty tie-in piece. It was created by people who understood these characters deeply and who wanted to explore a side of Trunks that the main Dragon Ball narrative had never had the time or the space to fully examine. The narration of the story unfolds in the first person. Trunks speaks directly to the reader, reflecting on his own life while Vegeta waits to enter the hyperbolic time chamber a second time, just before the Cell games are about to begin. Everything is told through his eyes and his memory, filtered through the particular way a young man processes grief and longing, and the complicated business of admiring someone he has never truly known face to face. It is the kind of story that does not announce its own depth. It moves quietly, it lingers on small moments. A photograph hanging in someone else's room. A question asked while a mother bends over machinery. The sound of a radio station playing information that nobody wanted to hear, but that everyone who was still alive needed. And in those small moments, it reveals something about Trunks that the main Dragon Ball narrative had gestured toward without quite saying aloud. He was not simply a warrior from a darker timeline, passing through the present on practical missions with a sword and a time machine. He was a boy who had spent his entire interior life building a relationship with a father he had never seen face to face, a father who existed for him only as a silhouette seen from behind, always moving forward, always refusing to look back. One of the memories Trunks returns to in the short story is the day his mother took him to visit Chi-Chi and Gohan. The journey itself would have been unremarkable by the standards of any ordinary time. Two survivors visiting two other survivors in a world where such visits had become rarer and more precious than they once had been. They traveled carefully, as everyone did in those years, aware of the particular arithmetic of risk that governed every decision about movement. But for Trunks, the day became something he carried forward long after it was over, not because of anything dramatic that happened, but because of a photograph hanging on a wall. In Gohan's room there were pictures of his family, pictures of Chi-Chi, pictures of relatives and ordinary moments, and among them, displayed without any particular ceremony, a picture of Goku, Gohan's father, who had died from the heart virus years before the androids had even arrived, whose absence had shaped Gohan's entire life in ways that neither of them spoke about directly. Trunks stood in that room and felt something he could not name precisely. He had grown up in a home without photographs, without the accumulated visual record of a family that has time and safety and the ordinary vanity of wanting to remember. His world had no such record. And here, in this quieter corner of a world that had also suffered, was evidence that a father could have a face, that a boy could look up from wherever he was and simply see the person he came from, without any effort or search. He looked at the picture of Goku for a long time. He thought about the particular quality that a full-blooded Saiyan must carry in person, something alive and distinct that he had never directly experienced. Goku did not look in the photograph like the most powerful person in the world. He looked calm, accessible, not especially threatening in the way that the most powerful things Trunks had encountered all tended to be threatening. When Gohan told him that Goku had been even stronger than Gohan himself, Trunks could not quite believe it. Gohan was the strongest thing he had ever witnessed. The idea of someone who stood beyond that felt genuinely impossible from where he was standing. And yet Gohan said it without hesitation, with the steady certainty of someone speaking from direct personal experience. The photograph stayed with him on the journey home, not as something distressing, but as a question that had settled quietly into the back of his thinking, and would take some time to fully work its way to the surface. While the two boys were together in Gohan's room that afternoon, a radio played in the background. The television stations had been destroyed. The official radio networks had largely been silenced as well. Communication between the surviving communities had become fractured and unreliable. A patchwork of signals that came and went depending on what equipment remained functional and what routes were currently being affected by the androids' movements. Information, like everything else, had become something you could not depend on arriving. But somewhere in the frequencies that remained, someone had built something that refused to be quiet. It was called the Artificial Human Report. a pirate radio station broadcasting from an undisclosed location dedicated entirely to tracking the movements and activities of the two androids who had reshaped the world. The station reported their last known location. It estimated where they might be headed next. It offered the grim and functional kind of information that people needed in order to make decisions about their own survival, which routes to avoid, which areas had recently gone silent, which settlements had not responded to contact in more than a certain number of days. The station broadcast without music, without advertising, without any of the comfortable texture that radio had once carried before the world changed. It was purely functional, a voice relaying data into the silence for whoever happened to be in a position to receive it. Trunks was aware the station was playing, but it was not what held his attention that afternoon. His thoughts were elsewhere, on the photograph, on Gohan's quiet certainty about his father's strength, on the slowly forming shape of something he did not yet have words for. The radio continued in the background while the boys sat in the room together. The voice listed information. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls, the world continued to be what it had become. The photograph of Goku had planted something in Trunks, and it grew quietly over the weeks that followed. He returned home from that visit, carrying a new kind of restlessness, not the anxious, urgent sort, but the slower and more patient kind that arrives when a mind has encountered a gap it would like to fill. He began to think more actively about his father, not abstractly the way he had before, but with a new directness that felt connected to the visual evidence the photograph had provided. He had always known in the distant way of someone working from second-hand information that his father had existed, that Vegeta had been real, had moved through the world, had crossed paths with his mother in a way that produced him. But the photograph of Goku had made the concept of a father more concrete somehow, more like a thing that could actually be known if you were given the right materials to work from. He wanted to ask his mother. He had been circling this question for a long time, aware of it without quite approaching it directly. He knew she would answer honestly. Bulma in this timeline was not a woman who softened things much, having found that the world required more direct handling than gentleness usually allowed for. But he found himself hesitating, and he recognized the hesitation as a kind of pride he had not quite examined before. Asking about his father felt like an admission of need. And he was not entirely sure, at this age, that needing things was something a warrior in training was supposed to do openly. Eventually, the question came out anyway. He asked her one afternoon while she was working on the time machine, bent over circuits and equipment, surrounded by the particular smell of focused work that Trunks had associated with his mother for as long as he could remember. The question came out less smoothly than he had planned it, but it came out. Bulma looked up from what she was doing, and she smiled. This detail mattered to Trunks, and he noted it specifically. She smiled, which was something she did rarely in those years, and the smile had memory in it, something complicated and real that was too layered for him to fully interpret at his age, but that he could feel the edges of. She told him what she could, and she told him honestly. Vegeta was strong, she said first, not strong in the practiced sense of someone who had worked diligently toward a measurable goal, but strong in the way of someone who had been built for it from the very beginning, who had been shaped toward it by everything his life had consisted of before she ever encountered him. The strength was not performance, it was simply what he was. He was also stern. He did not smile easily, or perhaps not at all in any way that most people would recognize as smiling. He kept his feelings at a considerable distance from his face, behind layers of pride that were too consistent and too comprehensive to be accidental. And that served the specific function of keeping the world from getting any closer than he had decided it should be allowed. He had done bad things, she continued. She did not soften this or build around it carefully. Vegeta had come to Earth as an enemy. He had traveled with people who destroyed entire planets as a matter of ordinary business. He had been, at various points in his life, someone you would not want to encounter without very good reason. She was not going to tell her son otherwise, because that would not have been true, and she respected him enough to keep it true. But, and this was the word that changed the entire texture of what she was saying, But underneath the sternness and the distance, and the history of choices that could not be taken back, she could feel something. She could tell, she said, in that particular and entirely Bulma way of knowing, which had always been more accurate than she usually gave herself credit for. He was more than the hard edges. He had qualities that mattered and that were real, even if he would never have displayed them without significant provocation. He was probably in hell right now, she said, and she said this without cruelty, the way someone says a truth they have already made their peace with. And then she followed it immediately by saying there had been good things too. Real ones. That was important. Trunks listened and learned something, not primarily about his father, but about his mother. The way she described Vegeta, the exactness with which she moved between his failures and his genuine qualities, the care she took with each word, told him something she would never have said in plain language. She had loved him. In whatever way Bulma loved things, which was always her own way and no one else's, something of that love was still present. And then she said something that stayed with him. You really do resemble him, particularly in your demeanor, and in that look you sometimes have in your eyes. He did a lot of bad things, she said again, and she said it without apology. But don't worry, you're more handsome. Bulma's strength was not only intellectual. The years had required more of her than that. At some point during the long period of her research on the time machine, a man came to see her. He was wealthy, or had managed to remain so in the way that certain kinds of people remain comfortable even when the civilization around them has collapsed, through stockpiling, through careful positioning, through the willingness to let other people absorb the worst of whatever is happening. He wore a powered suit of armor, which he used as personal protection against the androids, and he arrived at their facility with an offer. He said he wanted to fund her research. He spoke about the time machine in the language of philanthropy and shared purpose and the good that such a device could do for humanity. He framed everything with the care of someone who has thought about how to make something sound different from what it actually is. What he actually wanted was to use the time machine to escape, not to fix anything, not to travel back and change events, to give the world a different chance at a different outcome. He wanted to use it to get himself out of this timeline and into some other one, taking Bulma with him, and leaving every remaining human being, every struggling settlement, every survivor still managing to maintain some form of resistance against the androids, every person who had not yet given up, completely behind. He had dressed this plan in the vocabulary of generosity, and he expected it to work. Bulma's response was immediate and physical. She hit him once, firmly and without any preliminary warning or extended deliberation. The blow came from someone who had spent years surviving in a world that did not forgive hesitation, and it sent him, the power suit and all, flying in a direction that was not toward her time machine. The research was not for sale, and it was not for the use of anyone whose plan was to abandon the rest of humanity to whatever continued to happen to it. Whoever she had been before all of this began, the bright and comfortable and occasionally spoiled girl who had found the Dragon Balls out of a desire for a perfect boyfriend, that version of her had been replaced by something the world had forged over years of terrible necessity. Trunks watched this and understood something new about where he came from, the strength he was trying to build, the thing he was reaching toward in all his training. It had not appeared in him from nothing. It had a mother. As the years passed and Trunks trained with Gohan, the image of his father shifted from curiosity into something that functioned more like a destination. He had decided, without entirely planning to make this decision, that his father would serve as his measure. If he could reach Vegeta, if he could close the distance between himself and the silhouette he always saw from behind, could eventually arrive close enough to finally see his face, then he would know that he had become what he needed to be. Not because seeing his father's face would confer any specific power, but because it had become the internal organizing principle around which everything else was arranged. It gave the effort a direction. He knew almost nothing concrete about Vegeta's fighting ability. He knew his mother believed he had been extraordinary. He knew Gohan spoke about both Vegeta and Goku with the particular respect of someone who had seen them fight up close and come away changed by it. The image he had constructed was necessarily incomplete, assembled from fragments of other people's memories, outlined by his own imagination, lacking the grounding detail that first-hand experience would have provided. And yet, it held. It stayed clear in his mind across months and years of training and loss, and the particular grinding endurance of daily survival in a damaged world. Every training session that ended with aching muscles and the kind of tiredness that lives deeper than sleep can easily reach, Trunks came back to that image. The straight back, the forward motion, the absolute commitment to whatever lay ahead, with no apparent interest in what had been left behind. He told himself one day he would see his father's face, and when he did, it would mean he had finally arrived somewhere worth the journey. Trunks was not the only one running toward a figure he had lost. Gohan had his own version of the same pursuit, though he kept it quiet in the way he kept most things quiet. He had made himself an orange gi, not because orange was the most practical color for a fighter operating in a world of smoke and rubble, but because it was what Goku had worn. He had watched his father fight for years, absorbing not just the techniques, but the particular manner in which Goku carried himself in combat, the calm, the certainty, the way he approached even the most dangerous opponent with a confidence that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with genuine ease of spirit. He knew, he told Trunks one evening in the particular direct way he sometimes shared things, that he had not caught up to his father yet. He said it without embarrassment and without any need to soften it into something more comfortable. It was simply true, and he had accepted it, and the acceptance did not prevent him from continuing to try. Goku had been something Gohan was still reaching toward, even in a world where Goku was years gone, and the distance between them could not be measured in any conventional unit. When Trunks shared his own version of the same feeling, the sense of perpetually reaching toward a father he had never seen face to face, Gohan did not dismiss it. He did not tell Trunks it was sentimental or unbecoming of a fighter. He understood it completely because he lived it himself, in his own way, in the orange gi that no one had asked him to wear. Two young men, in a broken world, each reaching toward the silhouette of a man they had never fully known. Not a strategy for survival, something more human than strategy. The androids came, as they always did, without warning or preamble. Gohan made a decision before the fight that Trunks would only fully understand much later. He knocked Trunks out. He did it deliberately, with the care of someone who has thought something through and arrived at a conclusion he does not particularly want to act on, but will act on anyway, because that is what is required. Trunks was not yet ready. Gohan knew, with the calm precision of someone who has assessed a great many situations, exactly what was waiting on the other side of this particular confrontation. If Trunks was conscious, he would fight. And if he fought tonight, he would not survive tonight. So Gohan removed the variable and went alone. It was raining when Trunks came to. He would remember the rain for the rest of his life, not as a detail he had to work to recall, but as something permanently encoded, the way that the mind fixes on sensory information during its worst moments. As a kind of anchor, the streets were wet, and the world was very quiet, the particular quiet that arrives when sound has been removed suddenly rather than fading gradually. He found Gohan on the ground, still, not going to move again. What happened inside Trunks in that moment was not a single emotion. Several arrived at once, at a force that exceeded anything the word grief is normally asked to carry. Screams and anger and frustration and loss and something that didn't have a name, all of it arriving simultaneously, all of it needing somewhere to go that did not yet exist. And then something changed in the air around him. His muscles responded before his mind fully processed what was happening. His body made a decision that the conscious part of him could not have reached through reason alone. The air shifted and cracked, and the power that had been building in him for years, compressed by loss, directed by devotion, shaped by everything Gohan had tried to teach him, released all at once in a way that could not be controlled or directed or aimed at anything in particular. He became a Super Saiyan for the first time, kneeling in the rain beside the person who had been the nearest thing he had to a complete family, in a world that had already taken more from him than he had known it was possible to lose. The transformation of Super Saiyan is not simply a change in power. The Dragon Ball franchise has always treated it as something more than a mechanical upgrade, something more than one setting being replaced by a higher setting on the same dial. When Goku first achieved it on the planet Namek, it arrived on the back of grief, the murder of a friend who had meant more to him than most relationships Goku had maintained, a loss that bypassed every defense a lifetime of training had built and went directly to the interior. When Gohan achieved it in the Cell games, it came from a place even deeper, from a complete emotional release that Goku had recognized as the only remaining path, even at the cost of watching his son suffer in order to reach it. And when Trunks achieved it, kneeling in the rain with his hands pressed into wet ground, and Gohan still in the silence beside him, it was the same current moving through a different channel. Loss arriving in a body that had trained long enough to give it somewhere to go beyond simply being endured. He stood, and everything looked different from where he was standing. He fought the androids, and he was defeated. He was not ready, regardless of the transformation. Readiness is not only a question of the power available, but of what you know how to do with it, and there were dimensions of this fight that training alone could not yet have provided him. He recovered. He returned to his mother, who looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has just seen confirmation of something she had known was possible, but had not yet witnessed directly. He made a decision about what came after, not a dramatic decision, not announced with any particular ceremony. The decision was simply training, nothing else. He could not afford grief as a primary state of being, because there was no time for it. Bulma was still working on the time machine. The world still needed what it was going to take from him. The path forward was built from discipline and repetition, and the slow accumulation of capability, patient not in the passive sense, but in the active sense. Patient as a drawn bow or a held breath, he trained alone for years, in a world where he was the only one left who could. This surprised him when he noticed it. He had expected solitude to make everything harder, to make the internal image of his father recede or blur, the way familiar things do when the context that anchors them is removed. Instead, something unexpected happened. The image of Vegeta, always from behind, always moving forward, seemed to draw closer in the months of isolated training than it ever had in the years of working alongside Gohan. He took this as a signal, though he could not verify it as anything more than a feeling. It felt true in a way that sustained him through the long, quiet stretches of working alone in a world that offered very little in the way of external reinforcement. If the distance between himself and his father was shrinking, then he was doing something correctly. He was moving in the right direction, even without landmarks to confirm it. He absorbed himself in the mechanics of becoming stronger, with the steady discipline of someone who has accepted that this is simply what his life is now. Not obsessively. Obsession implies a frantic energy that does not survive long in genuine solitude, that burns itself out against the absence of an audience. But with the quiet dedication of someone who works each day because the work is necessary, and rests when necessary, and does not particularly need either external approval or external opposition to continue. He did not smile during this period. He had thought, in a dark moment early in those months, that he might never smile again, had felt this as a simple factual observation rather than as a lament. And then he had kept going anyway, because the alternative was not something he was prepared to choose. There was still a reason to be here. Bulma was still working. The time machine was still becoming something real. There was still a word that had not yet been written. The machine itself was remarkable in a way that is easy to underappreciate if you say it quickly. A single-person vessel, capable of crossing temporal dimensions, a project that had consumed years of her life and had required her to solve problems with no precedent using equipment that became harder to source and maintain with each passing month. She had done it, which should have been impossible, and which she had therefore done anyway, because those were the kinds of decisions she made. The plan was clear. Someone needed to travel back 20 years, to a time before the virus that had taken Goku, to deliver the heart medication that would have saved him, to give the world a chance to prepare, to provide a warning that this timeline had paid for in full. Before Trunks climbed into the machine for the first time, he did one thing. He painted a word on its exterior. One word, chosen carefully, felt right in a way that required no extended deliberation once he arrived at it. The word was hope. It was not an arbitrary choice. The word came from Gohan, from something Gohan had said, from the last words he had left with Trunks, before the night that changed everything. Trunks had thought about what word belonged on the only vessel that existed for this particular journey. He had considered and discarded other candidates, and the one that remained, the one that felt like it belonged, was the one Gohan had given him. Hope, written in a hand still shaped by grief, on a machine built by a woman who had refused to stop working, aimed at a world that did not yet know what was coming for it but would need every advantage it could be given. He had been instructed not to interfere beyond what was absolutely necessary. The mission was precise: deliver the medicine. Observe. Do not change the timeline more than was already being changed simply by the act of arriving. Do not engage in battles that were not his to fight. Complete the purpose and return. The instructions were sensible. He understood them completely and agreed with the reasoning behind them. And then he arrived before the others, before Goku, before anyone who had gathered expecting a ship from distant space. And Frieza was there. Frieza and his father, King Cold, had come to Earth with the straightforward intention of destroying it. Revenge for the events of Namek, or simply the natural extension of an approach to the universe that treated planets as assets to be managed and discarded as convenient. They were not expecting resistance. They were not expecting a young man with lavender hair and a sword to step out of nowhere and be a significant problem. Trunks killed them both. He did it efficiently, and without the particular hesitation that comes from treating such opponents as genuinely special. He had spent his entire life in a world shaped by beings like these, by the casual destruction they caused, by the specific texture of a world that had been broken by things that had decided humanity did not particularly matter. Frieza in his full power, in what should have been his most threatening form, and Trunks moved through the fight with the calm of someone who has spent years preparing for exactly this, and who has arrived. The warriors gathered on the ground watched this happen and could not quite locate a response that made sense. A Super Saiyan, young by all appearances. Someone none of them had ever seen before, moving through the fight as though it were not remarkable. Trunks had been told not to interfere beyond necessity. He had looked at what was in front of him and made a different judgment, and things, as it turned out, were all right. And with him, the moment Trunks had been carrying inside himself for as long as he could remember, he saw his father. He saw Vegeta, alive, standing, physically present in the world in a way that the silhouette in his mind had never been able to fully capture. And the first thing his eyes registered, before anything analytical could follow, was that Vegeta was standing with his back to him. Just like the image, exactly like the image. Strong, stern, carrying around him the particular quality of solitude that some people maintain, regardless of who is present, not because of circumstances, but because of something architectural in their personality that keeps the world at a measured distance. Everything Bulma had said, every word she had chosen carefully in that afternoon, beside the time machine. The person she had described was standing right there, and he was precisely as she had described him. Trunks had to hold himself very still. The words were right at the surface, ready to come out. I am your son. I come from a future that no longer exists as it was. I have been reaching toward you for my entire life. And he pulled them back at the last moment, because this was not the time and the timeline could not absorb it. He had a mission. He had a purpose, and revealing what he knew would change the shape of things in ways he could not entirely calculate. He kept the secret folded inward, where it had always been, and watched his father move through this past. Something happened that afternoon that Trunks had not prepared himself for. He caught himself smiling. It had been 3 years since the night Gohan died. 3 years in which the ordinary warm frequencies of life had felt like frequencies belonging to a different kind of existence, accessible in memory, not in experience. He had not been searching for a smile. He had not been thinking about whether one was possible. He was simply present in the afternoon, surrounded by people who did not yet know what they were going to lose. The way young Bulma laughed, the way Krillin talked, the particular noise and energy of people who belong to each other and know it without needing to say so, people who argue and move through the same spaces and take for granted the basic miracle of simply being together. He had lived for years in the absence of this, and he had adapted to the absence so completely that he had stopped noticing it as a loss. And then it was suddenly present again, all at once, in this afternoon, he thought. If this is the world his mother was fighting for, if this is what she had been refusing to stop believing in, then he understood, standing there and feeling the unfamiliar warmth of an ordinary moment, why it was worth everything she had spent, why the time machine was worth the years, why the word on its side was the right word. He caught himself smiling without having meant to, and then he noticed he was smiling, and then he let himself continue. He met Goku too, in that first journey. He had known the man only as a photograph on a wall in someone else's room, a calm face, accessible, not carrying the particular energy that the most powerful things Trunks had encountered always seemed to carry. In person, Goku was different from the photograph in ways that were difficult to immediately articulate. He was warm in a manner that felt almost disarming, comfortable with the world and with everyone in it, not because he was naive about what the world contained, but because his ease of spirit genuinely seemed to encompass all of it. Trunks did not tell Goku who he was. He kept his identity as carefully as he kept everything else. But he watched Goku closely, watched how he carried himself, watched how the people around him responded to his presence, watched the particular quality of a room when this man was in it. He thought about Gohan, about the orange gi and the photograph, and the quiet honesty of I haven't caught up to him yet. He thought about how Gohan had spent the remaining years of his life reaching toward a father the world had already taken, finding whatever he could to orient himself toward. Here, Goku stood, present and warm, exactly as Gohan had always been reaching toward. Trunks felt something he could not name precisely, a feeling that time was doing things that language was not built to describe, working in directions that produced outcomes he had not expected to find inside himself. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off, and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. When Trunks returned to the past a second time, things had changed in ways he had not fully anticipated. He had expected some degree of difference. The timeline he was visiting had already begun diverging from his own as a result of his first visit, and the information he had carried. Goku had received the heart medication, the warnings had been delivered. The Z fighters had been training and preparing, knowing what was coming in a way that the heroes of Trunks' own timeline had not been given the chance to do. But the androids were not what he had expected. Numbers 17 and 18 were different from the versions he had faced in his own world, not necessarily categorically more powerful in every dimension, but different enough to shift the entire shape of the battle and the strategies available to counter it. And there was something else entirely, a variable he had no reference point for, an entity whose existence in this version of events had not been part of anything he was prepared for. The world was responding to his interventions, the way that stories respond when you reach into them and move one element without accounting for everything connected to it. The timeline was alive. Every action Trunks had taken had registered somewhere in the fabric of events, and the fabric had reorganized itself around those actions and was now producing outcomes he had not been warned about. He observed all of this with the feeling of someone who has been told a story and then visited the place where the story happened and found it different from the telling. Not wrong, just more present, more specific, more complicated than any description can fully anticipate. The moment that broke something in Trunks arrived quietly, the way the worst moments so often do. Numbers 17 and 18 appeared, and Vegeta, who was present, who saw what was happening, who had the capability and the power to act, did not protect the people around him. He did not step between the androids and the others who were suddenly in danger. He stood apart in the particular isolation of someone for whom pride and self-determination have become such complete organizing principles that other considerations have difficulty reaching him even when they should. Trunks had been building a father for his entire life. Piece by careful piece, from whatever materials were available, from Bulma's honest description, from the silhouette he always saw from behind, from the physical reality of seeing Vegeta alive in this borrowed past. He had built the father he needed, which was the father the circumstances of his life had required him to construct. That father had absorbed all the longing and all the admiration and all the reaching toward that had no other place to go. And now he watched the real version fail. He thought about all of it at once. Every training session, every morning of discipline, every quiet internal moment of reaching toward the silhouette and holding the belief that when he finally arrived close enough, when the distance finally closed, it would mean something worth all the distance. He thought his mother's words were a lie in that moment. He thought he hated his father, and at the same time, underneath that, simultaneous with that, not replacing it, he wanted desperately to protect Vegeta from what was coming. He wanted both things at once, the hatred and the desperate care, with no resolution available between them. Vegeta fought Android 18 with total conviction. He had been warned. The information had been delivered multiple times and through multiple channels, by Trunks, by the others, by the evidence of fights already witnessed. The androids were more capable than they had been told. Vegeta had heard all of it and decided, as he always decided, that the information did not apply to him specifically, that the gap between himself and the warning was bridgeable by will. He was wrong. He was defeated thoroughly, and the defeat was not close or ambiguous, or marked by any of the small moments of near victory that can make a loss feel different from what it is. Android 18 moved through the fight with a calm efficiency that was almost casual, not indifferent exactly, but without the emotional investment that turns combat into something personal. She was simply better than him in every way that mattered in that exchange, and the result was the kind of loss that does not leave room for reinterpretation. Trunks stood among the others and felt the contradiction still churning through him without any sign of settling. Here was his father, defeated and in pain, pride and body both damaged, and the emotions that arose were not orderly. They did not arrive in sequence or take turns. They occupied the same space simultaneously, all of them real, none of them canceling the others. He had wanted his father to be the figure from the imagination, strong and certain, and forward-moving, and essentially invulnerable in the particular way that mythologized fathers always are in the minds of children who have never had the chance to know them as people. The person on the ground was a person, not a myth, not an idea, a person. In the aftermath of the battle, Trunks went to where Vegeta was. He sat near him in the way that people sit together when conversation is not quite possible, but presence still means something. The rock formation they occupied was ordinary, stone and sky and the particular quality of silence that follows violence when the violence has finished. There was no dramatic backdrop, just two people near rocks and everything unsaid between them, and the slow settling of whatever had been disturbed. Vegeta spoke. He made an observation about pure-blooded Saiyans, that for a Saiyan of pure blood, the stronger the opponent, the more powerfully the desire to fight rises to meet that strength. It was the kind of thing Vegeta said that functioned simultaneously as a statement about himself and as a test of the person listening. He said it without obvious direction, as though he were simply noting something aloud that happened to be true. Trunks understood immediately. If Vegeta was distinguishing himself as a pure-blooded Saiyan, he was distinguishing himself from a half-blooded one. If he was describing types of Saiyan with Trunks sitting directly in front of him, then he was accounting for the fact that Trunks was not the same type, which meant he knew exactly what type Trunks was. He knew Trunks was his son. He had known, or had arrived at it, through his own observation, which amounted to the same thing. And he had chosen not to make the acknowledgement direct, not to say it plainly, which would have required a kind of openness he was not built for. But he had made it clear enough that Trunks would understand he had been seen. Trunks sat with this and felt the landscape of his feelings shift once more. His father was difficult and proud, and had failed him in specific ways he had not been prepared for. And he was also perceptive in ways Trunks had underestimated. He saw more than he showed. He understood more than he said. He was making a different kind of acknowledgement than Trunks had expected, in the only language he seemed to have available. There was one more thing Vegeta said during that conversation that Trunks had not anticipated. He spoke about seeking something beyond Super Saiyan. Trunks had not considered this as a real possibility. The transformation had been, for him, the summit, the ceiling above which he had not thought to look. He had achieved it in the worst moment of his life, and then spent years learning to inhabit it, and it had functioned as both his answer to the enemies that remained and the measure of everything he was still trying to become. The idea of something beyond it had not occurred to him in practical terms. But Vegeta was sitting on those rocks, defeated, beaten by an opponent he had underestimated in pain, pride, and body, both showing the evidence of the exchange. And instead of dwelling on the defeat, he was already looking at what came next, not in denial of what had happened, not pretending that the loss was something other than what it was, but internally, genuinely, already in motion toward whatever lay on the other side of his current limit. Trunks would understand later that this was one of the most genuinely illuminating things he had ever witnessed about his father's character. The pride was real and total. The desire to win was absolute. But underneath both of those things was something even more fundamental and more permanent, a pure orientation toward forward motion, toward the next strength that had not yet been reached, toward whatever was waiting just past the current edge, just like the silhouette, always moving forward, never looking back. He watched his father and thought, and did not speak much. The conflict inside him had not resolved. It was still present, still occupying the same space in him without any indication that it intended to vacate. But something had shifted in the texture of it. Something had changed without announcing itself. Gohan had not been his father. He had been a mentor and a companion and a guardian, and the relationship had been real and deep and irreplaceable. But the relationship between a father and a son is a specific and particular thing that cannot be fully substituted by even the most loving and devoted equivalent. Trunks had known this in the abstract for most of his life. He was encountering it now in concrete form, with Vegeta sitting on rocks nearby, and all the complexity of an actual person surrounding what had previously been only an idea. He was learning in the uncomfortable way that real learning always works, that the person he had been chasing toward was more complicated than the image. That complication did not make Vegeta smaller. If anything, it made the pursuit more genuinely worth something, because you cannot actually know a silhouette. You can carry one for years, but knowing is something else, and knowing requires a person, not an image. He stayed on the rocks and watched, and thought, and let the 3 days pass. The training that followed was inside the hyperbolic time chamber. The chamber exists at the lookout, the platform above the atmosphere where the Guardian of Earth resides, and where Dende now served in that role after Kami's passing. Inside the chamber, time moves at a different rate. 1 full year passes inside for every day that passes in the world outside. The environment is extreme. Temperatures, pressure, a landscape of nothing in every direction that has a way of turning a person inward in ways that ordinary training does not quite manage. Vegeta entered first. He spent his year inside in a focus that the exterior world could not know the details of. When he emerged after a single external day, he had reached a state beyond what Super Saiyan had previously offered. An enhanced form with its own particular qualities and costs, which the fighters of that time would come to call the ascended Super Saiyan state. Trunks followed him into the chamber. He had his own year now, his own stretch of white nothing in every direction, to push toward whatever was waiting on the other side of his current limit. And inside that sealed space, cut off from everything external, Something happened to him that would become a problem. He came to believe that he had surpassed his father. The power he developed, the form that would later be understood as the third grade Super Saiyan state or Ultra Super Saiyan, was enormous. It felt like the summit. It felt like a rival. He emerged believing he was ready to defeat Cell. He was wrong. The fight with Cell was instructive in the specific way that clear defeats are instructive. Third grade Super Saiyan carried a fundamental flaw that the enormous sense of power it conveyed had obscured. The muscle mass required to maintain it reduced the fighter's speed to a degree that a sufficiently capable opponent could exploit. And Cell was that opponent, and exploited it, and the lesson was delivered without ambiguity. Power that cannot be made to land is not useful power. Strength that costs more in mobility than it gains in force is a trap, and Trunks had walked into it. He had not asked Vegeta whether the form was viable. He had believed, in the isolation of the time chamber, that he had moved past his father, and so asking had not occurred to him as necessary. The same pride that lived in him as inheritance. The same pride that had caused Vegeta to underestimate Android 18, the same pride that had been present in the Saiyan race as a whole, had cost him the thing he needed most, which was information he did not yet have. He survived, that at least was true, and sitting in the aftermath of the defeat, something in him shifted. Not a power, something quieter than power, an understanding of what his father had meant perhaps, by already looking toward what came next, even while sitting beaten on rocks, of why forward motion was the only motion worth maintaining, of what it cost to let a rival, any arrival, become a ceiling rather than a floor. The short story returns, in its final pages, to the moment where it began. Vegeta has been inside the time chamber for 20 hours. The Cell games are approaching. Trunks is waiting outside and reflecting, and the narrative of his own life has shifted into a different shape than it carried when he first began recalling all of this. He sees his father differently now. Not with the uncomplicated worship of a child who has built an idol from absence, and not with the burning disappointment of a young man whose specific and carefully constructed expectations have been broken against reality. With something more like clarity, more like what it actually looks like to see a person as opposed to an idea or a symbol. Vegeta is difficult and proud and has failed in ways that cannot be undone. He has also reached towards something extraordinary in ways that cannot be dismissed. He is both of those things simultaneously, without resolution, in the way that people are. He is a person, and if Vegeta's goal is Goku, which everyone who knows him can see, the way he has always been oriented toward the thing he cannot quite reach, always measuring himself against what remains ahead. Then Trunks has his own version of the same orientation. His goal is Vegeta, not to defeat him, not to prove anything at his expense, but to close the distance that has always been there, to arrive at the point where he can stand before his father and look at him, directly, face to face, and have his father look back, not at a back, a face. When I am able to look at my father's face, head on, and have him look back at me, then that will be when I have granted the wish I have had since I was very young. The story of future Trunks did not conclude with the Cell games. He appeared again, years later, in the Dragon Ball Super narrative, which continued the story of the franchise beyond the Buu saga. He arrived wounded, carrying himself with the exhaustion of someone who has been fighting without rest for too long, bringing news of something in his own timeline that was worse than anything the androids had been. Worse in the specific way that something familiar made into something wrong can be worse than an entirely foreign threat. A being called Goku Black had appeared in his future. A being who looked precisely like Goku, the face, the voice, the physical presence, but who was moving through the remaining human settlements with the calm and deliberate intention of destroying them. Not the casual destruction of the androids, which had been indifferent. Something purposeful, something that had decided with complete and terrible certainty that it was acting correctly. Trunks came to the past, seeking help. It was a familiar motion, the time machine, the journey, the arrival in a world that was safer than the one he had left. And yet the weight of it was different. He was older. He had seen more iterations of catastrophe than any person should be asked to survive. The uncomplicated hope of his first journey had been replaced by something more tempered, and he carried the tempered version without complaint, because that was what was available. The truth behind Goku Black revealed itself gradually, in the way that revelations tend to when the full truth is something the mind needs time to approach. He was Zamasu, a Kai from Universe 10, who had served as apprentice to the Supreme Kai Gowasu. Zamasu had developed, over time, a particular kind of certainty that mortals were a mistake in the architecture of existence, a flaw in the design of the universe that the gods who presided over it should have corrected long before now. He had looked at the history of mortal civilization, its violence, its repetition, its failure to improve in the ways he believed it should, and arrived at a conclusion that he held without doubt. He had used the Super Dragon Balls, the enormous wish-granting artifacts that transcended the ordinary Dragon Balls in scope and capability, to achieve what he needed to achieve. He had stolen Goku's body, and then he had moved through future Trunks' timeline, combining with another version of himself, pursuing the destruction of what remained of humanity with a patience and a certainty that made conventional opposition extraordinarily difficult. Trunks fought. He fought with everything available to him, which was considerable by any ordinary standard and not enough by the standard of what he was facing. He felt the gap between himself and the enemy in every exchange, knew it clearly in the way that experienced fighters know things about their situation that hope is tempting to override, and kept fighting anyway. Because stopping was not an option he was prepared to accept. Future Mai fought beside him. She was a survivor from his own time, a young woman who had endured everything the world had become and had not allowed it to determine who she was. She carried herself through the worst of it, with a quiet courage that Trunks noticed and that mattered to him in ways he did not always find language for. They had found each other in a world that kept trying to take everything, and what they had found was real. In the final battle of that arc, Trunks reached a state that no other fighter in the Dragon Ball story had quite reached in the same way or through the same path. He had been pushed past every familiar limit. The conventional framework for understanding Saiyan transformations does not fully accommodate what happened. It was not simply the next level in a recognized sequence. Something different was occurring, arising from a combination of his own power, his transformed state, and a technique that had historically belonged to a different kind of fighting philosophy entirely. He gathered ki, not just his own. He reached outward and gathered the life force of every living being remaining in the ruined future world. Every survivor, every person, still holding on in whatever shelter they had found, every last particle of hope that existed in a world that had been nearly emptied of it twice over. He compressed all of it into a form, a construct of concentrated energy, shaped, of all things, like a sword, a blade of pure spirit, built from the combined will of everyone who was still alive to contribute it. The attack did not win the battle alone. The enemy was too powerful, too certain in its own divine invincibility, for any single act to conclude things. But it changed the shape of the situation. It created a moment, a break in what had seemed unbreakable, that Goku, Vegeta, and Trunks himself could use to bring the arc to its end. This transformation, sometimes called Super Saiyan Rage by those who study such things, though the series itself never gave it a formal name, stands as one of the most distinctive power states in the entire franchise. Not because of its numerical value, which Dragon Ball fans have always loved to debate, and which the series has never fully codified, but because of what gave rise to it. Not isolation, not rivalry, not the grief of one person in one rain-soaked moment. Everyone, all at once, the collective hope of a dying world funneled through the hands of the person it had produced. The victory came at a cost that Trunks had not seen coming. Future Zeno, the absolute ruler of all universes in the Dragon Ball Super cosmology, who holds the most incomprehensible power available in the franchise with the casual manner of someone who finds everything mildly interesting, had been brought to future Trunks' timeline at an earlier point in the arc. When the danger had passed and the question of what happened next became pressing, future Zeno made a decision. He destroyed the timeline. All of it, every city and every sky and every remaining fragment of the world that Boma had spent years building a time machine to protect, gone in an instant, in the way that only something genuinely and completely absolute can make things gone. Not because of malice. The Dragon Ball cosmology does not present Zeno as cruel. Exactly. But because of a divine arithmetic that has no particular relationship to the feelings of the people caught inside its calculations. The androids had destroyed the world imperfectly over years, leaving ruins and survivors and the theoretical possibility of recovery. Zamasu had done worse, and now what remained was gone entirely, leaving nothing. Future Trunks had spent his entire life protecting this world, had trained through years of solitude for its sake, had painted a word on the side of a time machine and crossed 20 years of history in each direction repeatedly for its sake. And it was gone. They were not left without a path. The Grand Priest, one of the highest figures in the Dragon Ball Super cosmology, attendant to Zeno, arranged for future Trunks and future Mai to travel to a different timeline, not their own, a separate branch, parallel to the main story but distinct from it, a world without a Trunks of its own, where they could arrive and begin again without disrupting what had already been established there. It was a strange kind of ending, not a return home, because the home they had known was gone, not a defeat in any simple sense, because they were alive and they were together, and those two facts meant something. Not a conventional victory either, because the word had been redefined too many times in too short a period for its ordinary meaning to fully apply. Something in between, which is, perhaps, the most honest kind of ending available to people who have survived enough to understand how rarely things resolve into something clean. Future Trunks and future Mai arrived in a new world, carrying everything they had, which was themselves, and what they had become, and what they had kept of each other through all of it, which was enough to begin. In the full scope of the Dragon Ball franchise, Future Trunks occupies a position that belongs to no other character. He was the first to come from a different timeline, the first whose arrival in the main story was itself an act of love and desperation and hope encoded into the design of a small painted vessel. He introduced concepts that the series would return to repeatedly: the malleability of history, the weight of knowing what is coming, the question of what it costs a person to be the only one still carrying a future that everyone else has given up on. He was a half Saiyan who achieved the Super Saiyan transformation not through competitive drive or the ambition to surpass a rival, but through grief, pure and complete and entirely irreversible. And the franchise never allowed this to become casual, never stripped the achievement of the weight it carried in the moment it arrived, because the moment was specific and the weight was real. He fought Frieza in the past without being asked, and then met his father for the first time while keeping a secret about who he was. He trained in the hyperbolic time chamber and made the particular mistake that pride makes, and learned from it in the way that real lessons work, not cleanly, not immediately, but durably. He painted a word on a time machine and made the word mean something, and then proved it by going where the word pointed. He is, in many respects, the character who demonstrates most clearly what the Dragon Ball franchise is capable of when it slows down enough to look at what its stories cost the people living inside them. What it means, in genuine human terms, to reach towards someone you cannot quite reach. What it looks like to build a life from the back of a man you have never seen face to face. The Lone Warrior, the short story that contains so much of what has been explored tonight, exists at an interesting edge of the Dragon Ball library. It is not frequently discussed. It is not among the first things a new fan encounters, nor does it appear prominently in the most commonly shared lists of essential Dragon Ball reading. It is the kind of thing that rewards the person who happens to find it and remains unknown to everyone who doesn't go looking. Written by Aya Matsui and illustrated by Bor Ma, it carries the particular quality that supplemental Dragon Ball material sometimes achieves when it is placed in the hands of people who genuinely understand these characters. It does not add new plot points or introduce new powers, or alter the architecture of what the main story established. It adds interiority. It gives Trunks a continuous inner voice through the most consequential years of his life, and in doing so, it makes the outer events mean more than they mean on their own. The relationship between the short story and the main Dragon Ball narrative is like the relationship between a person's inner life and their outer behavior. The events are visible in both places, but the inner version explains what the outer version can only gesture toward, why someone makes the choice they make, what they carry forward after the worst has passed. The two other short stories published alongside the Trunks piece, one focused on Piccolo, one on Vegeta, are shorter, less internally expansive, but their existence alongside the Trunks story says something about what the people creating Dragon Ball wanted to explore in the spaces between larger narratives. Characters who fight and transform and win and lose are interesting. Characters who think about why they do these things and what they cost and what they hope to find at the other end, those characters are something more. Dragon Ball has always been a story about people who train and push themselves past their current limits in the pursuit of becoming something greater than they currently are. The short stories, including the Trunks one, ask a question the main narrative rarely has time for. Greater than they currently are? In what sense, exactly? What are they reaching toward when they reach toward power? What would it look like to arrive somewhere that mattered? For Trunks, the answer was specific. He wanted to see his father's face. He wanted to stand before him directly, look at him, not at his back, but at his face, and have his father look back. That was it. Not the defeat of any enemy, not the achievement of any transformation. A face and a look returned, something that ordinary children receive without thinking about it, and that Trunks had been reaching toward across years and timelines and the entire length of a story that had never been easy. One of the more quietly significant threads in the future Trunks narrative is the difference between the androids of his own timeline and the ones who appear in the main story. In future Trunks' world, 17 and 18 are overwhelming. They move through whatever they encounter with a casualness that is, in its own way, more unsettling than dedicated malice would have been. They are not working toward anything. They are not building anything. They destroy because they can, and they do it without any apparent awareness that the destruction has weight. The world they inhabit is the world they have made, and they have no relationship to what it used to be. In the main timeline, the androids that the Z fighters encounter are also powerful but constituted differently. The circumstances of their creation had diverged in ways that produced different emphases, different dispositions, different specific qualities of capability, familiar enough to Trunks to be recognizable, different enough to confirm that the timelines had genuinely separated, that his information was accurate in broad outline but not in every particular. He arrived in the past with knowledge that was simultaneously true and not quite true, correct about the shape of things. He had to navigate a world where what he knew was a useful starting point but not a reliable map, where his preparation from one version of events had to be adapted on the fly to account for a different version of the same events. He adapted, as he always adapted, as the world had been training him to since the night he was born into it. The image that moves through the short story, the silhouette of Vegeta always from behind, always moving forward, is worth sitting with in a quiet way before the end. It is a specific image. Trunks does not imagine his father as an abstraction or a general presence. He imagines him with precision, the back of a man, standing straight, facing something ahead, in motion without looking back. This image was built from pure absence, from a gap so complete that there was not even a photograph to anchor it. And yet, it is particular in the way that real portraits are particular. There is something in this about how people construct the people they love when those people are not present. We do not construct abstractions. We construct specifics. We choose one angle, one posture, one quality of what they might look like, and we hold it, because holding something specific is possible in a way that holding a general absence is not. And the specific thing Trunks chose to hold was someone moving forward, not standing still, not looking back, moving forward, committed to where they were going, in the way of someone for whom the direction is not in question and the only variable is how much further ahead the destination might be. He could have built any image. He built that one, which is not a neutral choice, which says something about what he was actually reaching toward. Not just the face of his father, but the quality in his father that he had intuitively selected to represent him. Forward motion, commitment to the next thing, the specific refusal to look back. Future Trunks is not the only Dragon Ball character to grow up without a father's full presence. Gohan spent significant portions of his early years separated from Goku by training, by battle, by death itself on multiple occasions. The franchise has always been comfortable with fathers who are absent for reasons the narrative presents as largely unavoidable. But the particular shape of Trunks' version is different. Gohan always knew what his father looked like. He had accumulated years of Goku's presence, however interrupted and however frequently cut short. The voice, the face, the physical reality of being in the same room as the person who was his father. The foundation was there, however imperfect. The face was known. Trunks had a silhouette from behind. That was the entirety of his inheritance from his father, until the time machine gave him the chance to accumulate something more. No voice, no face, a posture and a direction, and the sense of someone moving into something that was not looking back. And he built a life from it. He built a direction and a goal and a standard by which he measured his own progress and a destination toward which he aimed everything he trained for. He built a father from whatever materials were available, and that father held, carried him across years and into a past that was not his own and through battles that should have been impossible, and back again, and eventually to a moment of seeing. This, perhaps, is what Future Trunks offers the Dragon Ball story about absence and inheritance, and what a person can construct from not very much. You can carry a silhouette. You can carry a single word painted on the side of a machine. You can carry incomplete information and a direction, and the back of someone you have never seen face to face, and you can run toward all of it for years, and it can be enough to become who you need to be. The heart medicine that Trunks carried into the past deserves a moment of attention. It was a small thing, a vial, something synthesized by the people of a future that had already paid the price of not having it in time. Goku's heart virus was a solvable problem. There was a cure. There had always been a cure. The cure simply arrived too late in Trunks' timeline to matter. The medicine worked. The delivery was the failure. Trunks corrected the delivery. He crossed 20 years and an entire dimension of time to put a small vial of medicine in the hands of a doctor who could use it before the problem became permanent. In terms of the things he did across all of his visits to the past, this was the least dramatic, the most immediately practical, the most specifically actionable. Here is something I can do, so I will do it. There is something in this that speaks to a particular kind of hope, not the sweeping, certain kind that believes a single great act will solve everything, but the patient, specific kind that understands that improvement comes from small things delivered carefully and consistently. You bring what you have. You do what is possible in the moment you're in. You trust that the cumulative effect of small, deliberate actions adds up to something worth the effort. He painted the word hope on the machine. The medicine he carried was hope made concrete, a treatment that could not undo what had already been lost, but could prevent the same loss from happening to someone else in a world that still had a chance. It is worth returning before the end of this evening to Bulma. Future Bulma built the time machine. This fact is stated in the Dragon Ball narrative as though it is simply one item on a list of things that happened, presented at the same pace as everything else. It is not. It is extraordinary. Building a device capable of crossing temporal dimensions, solving problems that have no precedent. Because the field has no precedent, developing solutions that cannot be looked up in any existing body of knowledge, doing all of this while the world outside your laboratory continues to deteriorate, is an achievement of a different category than the ones that get discussed most often when Dragon Ball's accomplishments are tallied. She worked on it in a world where her resources were shrinking and her options were narrowing, and the people she might have asked for help were largely gone. She tested and failed, and began again repeatedly over years in the specific iterative way that genuine invention works when you are not building on the work of anyone who came before you, because no one came before you. She did this while managing daily survival in conditions that did not forgive carelessness, while raising her son, while being the kind of person her son could look at and understand, without being told directly that strength and love, and refusal and stubbornness are not separate qualities that coexist awkwardly. They are the same quality appearing in different contexts, all of them expressions of the same thing. The time machine that Trunks painted the word hope on was hers. The journey that changed multiple timelines was made possible by her work. The medicine that saved Goku was delivered in a vehicle that exists because she refused, repeatedly and over years, to stop building it. Her contribution to the Dragon Ball story is measured in every outcome that follows from the decision she made not to give up, which is most of the outcomes. The Cell Games, the climax of the main Dragon Ball Z timeline toward which everything in that arc builds, resulted in a victory that Trunks observed with the complicated feelings of someone who knows both what it costs and what it changes. In his own timeline, the Cell he had faced was different. The sequence of events had produced a different version of that threat, and the battles and outcomes of Trunks' own future were not identical to what he witnessed in the past. This was one more confirmation of what he had been learning throughout his visits. The timelines were genuinely different, not just delayed versions of each other. And knowing one did not mean knowing the other. After the Cell Games ended, Trunks prepared to return to his future. But he stopped first. He faced the androids and Cell of his own timeline, both of them still present in the future where they had not yet been defeated. This time, he was ready in all the ways that mattered. The training in the hyperbolic time chamber, the defeat against Cell, the lesson absorbed from that defeat, the understanding of what his power could do when he did not allow the form to slow him down. All of it was present with him. He defeated them efficiently and without particular drama, the way someone solves a problem they have taken the time to actually understand. The world he returned to was not healed. The damage of years could not disappear with the defeat of the cause, but the threat was gone. The future could begin genuinely to recover. There is something worth noting as this narration moves toward its end about the way Future Trunks' story closed in the original Dragon Ball Z arc, before Dragon Ball Super opened another chapter. He goes home. He does what he set out to do. He returns to the world he left and makes it safer, and then continues living in it. Not as a hero who has been given a celebration and a monument and a formal recognition of what his efforts cost him. He simply returns and keeps going, because that is what living looks like after the extraordinary has been survived. The Dragon Ball franchise has a strong pull toward the next crisis, the next transformation, the next threat that disrupts whatever peace the previous resolution purchased. But in the specific case of Future Trunks, after the Cell Saga, there is a breath, a genuine arrival, a moment in which the story allows him to have reached the place he was going. He went looking for his father's face. He found it, and it was complicated, and it was real, and it was enough. Not because everything resolved cleanly. A person as complicated as Vegeta does not simplify into something uncomplicated just because his son has spent years reaching toward him, but because Trunks had enough. Enough to stop carrying the silhouette as a myth and start understanding it as a person. He had his wish, the one from when he was very young. The story of Future Trunks is, in its quietest form, the story of what determination looks like when it has nowhere comfortable to rest. It cannot rest on the security of family, because the family that would have provided that security was largely absent before he was old enough to understand what he was missing. It cannot rest on the assurance of victory, because the androids had demonstrated repeatedly and conclusively that victory was not guaranteed regardless of effort or preparation. It cannot rest on hope in the optimistic and uncomplicated form, because hope in that form would have been destroyed the first night it was tested against the actual conditions of the world he lived in. What remains, after all of that, is something different from conventional hope. It is something more like the decision to continue. One more day of training, one more attempt to close the distance between himself and the image in his mind. One more crossing of 20 years and back again, carrying medicine and information and a word painted on a metal surface in whatever paint was available. Dragon Ball has always been, at its quietest and most honest, about this decision. Not about the power levels, which are enormous and constantly expanding and easy to get lost inside. Not about the transformations, which are visually extraordinary and have become a cultural touchstone in ways that the people who created them probably did not fully anticipate. But about the decision to continue, made every morning, made in the rain beside someone who is not going to get back up, made on rocks beside a father whose face you are still not quite seeing, made in a time chamber alone with the particular silence of everything external having been removed. Trunks painted the word hope on the time machine, and he went and he came back, and he went again and came back again. And somewhere in all of that motion, all that crossing and returning and facing and training and grieving and continuing, he saw his father's face. This detail is worth pausing on, because the Dragon Ball franchise does not explain it in the main series, and the absence of explanation says something interesting about how the story was constructed. The sword appears when Trunks does. It is simply there, part of his design, part of his visual identity, from the moment he steps out of the time machine. He uses it to kill Frieza, he wears it throughout his time in the past, and the main narrative never pauses to offer an origin story for it. It is presented as a given, the way a character's clothing is a given, without any particular acknowledgement that viewers might wonder where it came from. What we can observe is what the sword represents visually and thematically in the context of the character. The Dragon Ball franchise in its core arc, through the original series and Dragon Ball Z, is defined almost entirely by ki-based combat, punching and kicking and energy blasts, and the specific vocabulary of techniques that characters develop through training. The sword is different. It is a weapon, a tool external to the body, which requires a different set of skills, and which suggests a different relationship to combat than the one that defines most Dragon Ball fighters. Trunks with a sword implies a Trunks who trained with something other than pure ki combat, who sought skill in a direction that the other Z fighters did not particularly pursue, who came from a timeline where adaptation took precedence over purity of style, where you used what you had, what worked, what was available, rather than adhering to the particular tradition of how Dragon Ball fighters are supposed to fight. The sword was eventually omitted in later appearances. By the time Dragon Ball Super came around, Trunks carried a shorter blade and then in the anime famously created an energy construct in the shape of a sword during his final battle. The physical weapon gave way to the metaphorical one, a sword made of hope rather than metal, which is a trajectory that suits the character and his story. The television special titled The History of Trunks was broadcast in Japan in the year 1993. It adapted the story of future Trunks' timeline in direct animated form, the events that the main Dragon Ball Z series had referenced and described but never shown in full detail. The special covered the deaths of the Z fighters. It showed Gohan older, fighting alone, bearing his missing arm. It showed Trunks' transformation in the rain. It showed Bulma working and planning and believing when everything external suggested that belief was unreasonable. It was, for many viewers, the first time they had seen this side of the story rendered fully, the first time the tragedy of the alternate timeline had been displayed, rather than simply stated. The special was written with a different tone than the main series typically maintained. It moved more slowly, dwelt more fully on the weight of what was happening, gave more time to the emotional logic of the story than action sequences required. It understood, apparently, that the story of future Trunks was primarily a story about loss and determination and the specific cost of being the last one left, and it treated that story accordingly. Audiences responded to it. The special has remained, across the decades since its broadcast, one of the most well-regarded pieces of Dragon Ball media among long-term fans. One of the things people point to when they want to demonstrate that the franchise is capable of more than the combat and power scaling that dominate most discussions of it. It demonstrated that the characters carried enough weight to support a story that was primarily about them rather than about their fights. There is a timeline that Trunks created without meaning to. When he traveled to the past and intervened, killing Frieza and Cold, delivering the medicine, observing, and interacting with the world of 20 years prior, he did not change his own timeline. The physics of Dragon Ball's time travel, as they are eventually understood through the story, do not work that way. What he did instead was branch a new timeline from the point of his first arrival. The past he visited became a separate reality, diverging from his own at the moment of his intervention and proceeding forward from there as its own thing. His own future remained exactly as he had left it. The androids were still there. Gohan was still gone. The word hope was still painted on the time machine. Nothing he did in the past changed anything about his present, because his past and the past he visited had separated the moment he arrived in it. This is the detail that the Dragon Ball story eventually provides to explain the presence of the Cell who appears in the main timeline, a Cell who originated from yet another branch of time, who had traveled to the past himself through a time machine he had discovered, who was operating in a timeline he had helped to create, and then abandoned. The time travel mechanics of the Cell saga involved at least 4 separate timelines, each diverging from the others at different points, each proceeding independently once the separation occurred. Future Trunks was the origin point of all of this. His first journey created the branch. Cell's journey followed the path Trunks had opened, and Trunks' subsequent visits added further layers to a situation that had become substantially more complicated than anyone in any of the timelines had fully calculated at the outset. He had not intended any of this. He had intended to deliver medicine and information in return. The complications were the inevitable result of time being what it is when you put something into it that wasn't there before. In the immediate period after the Cell saga ended, in the main timeline, not in his own, Future Trunks spent time with the people of that world in a way that the main narrative handles briefly but which carried obvious weight. He had grown up in a world where the Z fighters were names and photographs and the particular presence of Gohan. Here, they were alive. Krillin was alive, recognizable from Gohan's descriptions and from years of hearing him referenced as someone significant. The others were present, people whose existence in his own timeline was something he had grown up knowing only as historical fact, present here in ordinary human form, occupying space, making noise, being alive in the way that people are alive when they are not yet aware of how temporary that state can be. He met the child version of himself. This was perhaps the strangest part. The baby Trunks of the main timeline, the one who would grow up with 2 parents and a fundamentally different relationship to safety and to the world, was simply there, too young to understand the encounter, too young to know what it meant that this older version of himself had come from somewhere much harder and was going back there when his business was done. What Trunks felt, observing the infant version of himself in the arms of people who were alive when they should have been gone, is not something the narrative has ever directly articulated, but the scene of it exists in the main Dragon Ball Z story as a quiet and slightly surreal moment that does not require extensive commentary. The juxtaposition does its own work. A future self and a present self in the same room, on either side of an enormous divergence, neither of them quite the same person as the other. Future Gohan, the version of Gohan who trained Future Trunks and who died in the rain, deserves a fuller accounting than the main Dragon Ball narrative has time to provide. He had been a child prodigy in the truest sense during the Frieza saga, a young boy whose power in a moment of crisis had exceeded what every adult around him had spent years trying to build. He had been nurtured by his father, then trained by Piccolo, then thrust into situations that should have been beyond his capacity repeatedly and had met each of them. He had always carried alongside his fighting ability the particular weight of being Goku's son in a world that had very high expectations of what that meant. In the alternate timeline, the weight had a different shape. He survived the android attack that killed the others, and the survival itself became a burden, the one who remained with everything the remaining entails. He trained Trunks with all the seriousness of someone who has understood that what he does now is the only investment in a future that is worth making. He mentored without the safety net of other fighters available as backup, without the resource of Bulma's full capability applied to the fighting side of things, without any particular guarantee that his efforts would produce the outcome he was working toward. He lost his arm in one of those fights. The canon is clear on this. Future Gohan lost his left arm in battle against the androids and continued fighting anyway, which is the part that tends to stay with people when they think about this version of the character. Not the loss itself, which is painful but not surprising given what he was facing. The continuation, the decision to keep going after the loss, with one arm, against enemies who had already demonstrated that one arm was not enough, because stopping was not an option he was prepared to select. He told Trunks, before the final night, that he hadn't caught up to his father yet. He said this in the quiet way he said most things, without any particular drama around it. It was simply true, and he wanted Trunks to know that the orange gi and the reaching and the measuring of himself against an absent father were not things he was ashamed of. They were real. They mattered. They were allowed to matter. He went alone on the final night because he believed Trunks was not ready. He was right about that. He had always been accurate about these things. And he went anyway, because readiness was not the question that decided whether you had to try. Dragon Ball Super handles the Future Trunks arc differently in its manga and anime versions, and both treatments illuminate something about what the creative teams at different levels of the franchise were thinking about when they returned to this character after years away. The anime arc, which was produced first and became the version most widely seen, expanded the story considerably. It gave more time to future Mai, developing her presence and her relationship with Trunks across a longer span of episodes. It rendered the battles with more visual detail and allowed the energy of Trunks' final transformation to have space to develop and breathe before its conclusion. The manga version, drawn by Toyotaro and overseen by Akira Toriyama, moved more quickly and made different choices about which elements to develop. It gave Future Trunks a slightly different resolution to the arc and handled the cosmological elements in a way that was compressed but internally consistent. What both versions share is a commitment to taking Future Trunks seriously as a character rather than simply as a returning fan favorite. He is not brought back as nostalgia. He is given a real problem, a real emotional arc, a real cost at the end of it. The creative teams behind Dragon Ball Super understood that Future Trunks had earned his significance through the Cell Saga story, and they treated the return accordingly. The result is an arc that many Dragon Ball Super viewers consider one of the strongest in that series, not necessarily the most action-packed, not the one with the largest power scaling, but the one with the most emotional specificity and the most genuine stakes for the character at its center. Akira Toriyama has spoken across various interviews and supplemental materials about the Dragon Ball characters and their origins, and some of those reflections touch on Future Trunks in ways that illuminate the intention behind the character's design. The concept of a future version of an existing character, a darker and more experienced Trunks arriving before the version the audience would come to know in the main timeline, was not a simple decision in terms of storytelling structure. It required the audience to understand immediately that this was a different character than the child they had seen briefly before, while still being the same character. It required visual design that communicated history and seriousness without losing the underlying identity. The result was a character who felt distinct from every other Dragon Ball fighter while remaining clearly recognizable as a Saiyan, as Bulma's son, as someone who came from the established world of the franchise. The lavender hair, lighter than Bulma's more vivid blue, and the sword and the clothing all combined into a visual identity that has remained one of the most recognized in the franchise's history. The character worked because he arrived with a specific weight, not a generic one, not the weight of being powerful or being important to the plot, but the weight of having lost specific things in a specific world and made specific decisions about what to do afterward. That specificity is what the Lone Warrior short story later explored in depth. The interior life of a person shaped by exactly those losses and decisions, reaching towards exactly the thing that the losses had made most precious to him. There is one more quiet detail in the story of Future Trunks that tends to get lost in discussions of the larger arc, the way his relationship to time itself becomes a defining characteristic of who he is. Most Dragon Ball characters exist in a single timeline. Their past is fixed, their future is uncertain, and the present is the only place they operate. Trunks crosses that structure repeatedly. He has lived in a future. He has visited a past. He has been present in a timeline that is neither his origin nor his destination, and has had to hold multiple versions of the same world in his understanding simultaneously. This gives him a perspective that no other character in Dragon Ball quite has. He has seen what the world becomes without intervention. He has seen what it looks like when the good outcome is fought for. He has seen a Vegeta who dies never knowing his son, and a Vegeta who sits on rocks and makes a careful acknowledgement in the only language available to him. He has seen a Bulma who never stopped building, and a world that was nearly destroyed twice over, and a self who was made from both of those things. He carries all of that, and he keeps going anyway, which is the truest thing the story of Future Trunks ever says about what hope actually looks like when it has been tested until all the comfortable versions of it have been removed. And with that, the evening settles. The world of Future Trunks has its weight and its losses and its particular kind of earned quietness, but it also has the painted word on the side of a machine that a mother built from nothing, and the smile that surprised a young man who had not expected to smile again, and the moment on the rocks when a father made a careful acknowledgement in the only language available to him, and the 3 days of watching and thinking and letting the contradiction live inside without demanding it resolve. It has the picture of Goku on a wall in someone's room, and what that picture set in motion. It has a pirate radio station broadcasting into the dark, and a rich man who needed to be punched out of a window, and an orange gi worn by someone reaching toward a person already gone. It has a word gathered from everyone still alive, shaped into something that looked like a sword. These are the quiet contents of a story that the Dragon Ball franchise carried alongside its louder ones, without always taking the time to display them directly. They are worth the time. Thanks for spending this time in the Dragon Ball universe with me. If you'd like to keep drifting, another video is ready on the left of your screen. Maybe let it play as you close your eyes. Sleep might find you before the next story finishes.